What's it saying? Amy, how you going?
I'm good, Guy. How are you?
Very well indeed. We were just having a conversation about the intersection between naturopathy and spirituality, and a couple of little terms that I've come across in my research into this is this idea of biopsychosocial spiritual. Can you explain what that is?
Well, I think it's a modern attempt to try and give a more specific title to the concept of holism. And holism is a core philosophical tenet of naturopathy. And it acknowledges that you can't engage with anyone's healing journey without accepting that they are a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual being. And so imbalances in any of those areas in someone's life can impede their ability to be fully well in all its forms. And so that's really the idea of that. And so it's not to say that we center spirituality in a naturopathic healing consultation or treatment plan, but we acknowledge it, and where the person is open to having that conversation, we support and encourage them to have an enriched spiritual life, whatever that means for them.
Yeah, and it's that whatever that means for them, which is a really kind of difficult part of a conversation about spirituality, but it's not completely unframed. So what I've seen here, again, just in my little bits of reading, that in the context of naturopathy, then spirituality is referring to values, beliefs, identity, and purpose. And it's sort of that inner, one of those expressions is the inner self, that sort of stuff that's that is deeply seated in us. And so what they're saying as well is, just to use one of these quotes here, that what was it? So whatever one needs to fill one's spiritual coffers, and for some people that might be going to a church, but for other people it might be going to a forest, and it's obviously the forest part which is of the greatest interest to Vita Sapien. So values, beliefs, identity, and purpose. Would you add anything to that list? Is that how you'd frame it?
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea, particularly, the naturopathic approach, it's incredibly person-centered, and so there's a real emphasis on working within the value system of the person that you're providing care for, but the examples that you gave are really great, because one of the things, and I guess this is a slight deviation from your question, but the naturopathy not only recognizes that people can have a spiritual engagement with nature, they actually recognize that engaging with nature is actually a healing experience unto itself. And there's a heap of science around it, but even at a level that science as yet cannot measure, there's a healing element of just being in a natural space. And that is one of the principles of naturopathic practice. So we've got core philosophical tenets that underpin everything that we do, and holism being one of them. But we've got 7 accepted naturopathic principles, and one of those is the healing power of nature. Right.
And and of course, nature is a really interesting word that I've had to define a few times, because and I'll just deviate here just to come back to this point. If a monkey uses a stick to get ants out of an ant's nest, then you could say that the use of the tool is natural, and by definition, the development of nuclear weapons is also natural if you're following. So nature needs to be defined, if you know what I'm saying. Nature also involves black holes and subatomic particles, but that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about nature. We're talking about being in landscapes, coastlines, forests, streams, rivers, and so forth. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Naturopaths deal really well with complexity. They non-linear thinking and understanding complex systems is a really critical component of how naturopaths understand the health of a person and the world that they live in. And so as a result, most of those things that we do are layered. So in the concept of the healing power of nature, there's the fact that using natural treatments or treatments that are derived from as close to the naturally occurring source as possible is the preferred way to start a treatment. So we actually draw on nature to provide treatment, but we also accept that being in nature is part of treatment. And so it's a multi-layered view. But yes, in the term that you're talking about, landscapes, environments, going for a walk on the beach, getting some fresh air, just, it doesn't have to be locking yourself in a log cabin for a month. It's just simply a case of out, touching a few trees as you're walking down the street and just having that contact with the natural growing world that surrounds us, but we're often so disconnected from.
Yeah, lovely. And of course, that sort of suggests that maybe a lot of the ailments that we have, that we need curing from, if you like, are actually sort of caused by the technosphere in a way. The fact that we live surrounded by stuff that we've built and tarmac and concrete and motor vehicles and exhaust is sort of, part of this underlying, health issue, is the fact that we actually live in the thing that we've created, and that we've had to actually push aside natural landscapes in order to build it, and it comes back to this, a term that I'll quote this. It's from, I read this years and years ago and it just stuck in my mind. Let me see if I can just find the quote. This was in the conquistadors that went into South America, the Spanish Hernan Cortez, said to one of these Mayans, or one of these indigenous tribe people, he says, "I and my companions suffer from a disease of the heart, which can only be cured with gold." And that was the explanation of why it was that they were prepared to rape and murder and kill millions of people, because and again, it comes back to this disease of the heart, the soul, the spirit. And part of the conversation I was having yesterday on Zoom with Dr. Peter Carter, who's a physician, but is also an expert IPCC reviewer, so for the climate change reports. And we were talking about oil men, fossil fuel executives who continue to perpetuate this ecocidal industry, and how what's fundamentally wrong or allowing them to do that work is that there is something spiritually out of balance with them, or out of balance with respect to nature, obviously not out of balance with respect to making money and power. Okay, and so I guess what I'm sort of seeing here, that through this spiritual angle of naturopathy, you've actually got a way of sort of explaining the destruction of the global ecosystem because of this spiritual disease of the heart that many people have. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's not always going to be the cause of the condition, but it is always going to be getting in the way of the healing. And so putting someone, no matter what their underlying cause is, and we're always looking for the underlying cause. It's one of our other principles, is treat the cause, not the symptoms. And so we're always looking for that, and we're looking deep, and there's a lot of detective work that's going on around it. And it's very, very rarely, particularly these days with so much non-communicable disease, so much chronic illness, it's very rarely just one thing.
Yeah.
It's really not even just two things. It's a multitude of things that either exacerbate or enhance in some way the severity of the person's health issues. So I think that and being a part of nature, being connected with nature, having some space away from the technological penetration of our life, is a big part of that. And I think that, yes, it does play out in lots of other areas. It creates the psychological imbalances that disconnection from nature creates, can, I think, lead to some of the things that you're talking about. People making decisions that are not based on respect for the life cycle of the planet and of humanity. And so that they end up so disconnected from simple rhythms of life that they can't seem to make decisions that actually respected it anyway.
Yeah, okay, that's really good stuff. That's and that makes a lot of sense. Back to this idea of the spiritual coffers, and so in my Vita Sapien, the booklet that I write, one of the little passages that I keep coming back to in finessing is that the many different things that we can put into our spiritual coffers, like a little chamber that you can open up, like a sea chest, and you put different things in. And what we've sort of been trying to sort of put forward is that you've got to have a bunch of nature sitting at the bottom of that. It doesn't matter if you're spiritually connected, by things that aren't nature. That's not really the problem so much as that a proportion of your spiritual coffers ought to be filled with this nature stuff in order, and it's grounding because it's like an ultimate truth. It predates the technosphere,
Yeah, and I think my experience of talking to people about Vita is they all get that feeling of looking at, whether it's just a tree in full flower or a beautiful sunset or something like, they get that feeling of it just hits you in the heart. And what they don't usually do is connect that with a sense of spirituality. And so this idea of the spiritual coffers is a great one, because I think people could really resonate with that it feels a part of them that nothing else seems to fill. Yeah.
I was in France recently, as you know, at this residency, and we did a trip to La Salle 4, which is the cave. It's a near perfect replica of the cave that was full of 900 paintings by the Cro-Magnon people. I had a really moving experience stepping into that cave. I mean, I had tears coming out of my eyes. And it took me a little while to sort of sit back and process what was it about that place that made me, give me that emotional response. And I think when I come down to it, it was getting back in touch with the native human being. So, we've grown up, like I'm 55, for example, but I've grown up surrounded by motor cars and houses and ideas of religion and God and all the rest of it. And when you step into the cave that the Cro-Magnon had painted, you sort of step back 20,000 years, way before any of the modern philosophies, way before any of the modern technologies. And you get a sense of who we are in a sort of a native sense. And it gives that clarity about all of the other layers that are in our heads and our hearts, if you like, that are kind of not part of that natural man. So naturopathy quite often is focused around a lot of traditional medicines, sort of indigenous medicines and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's defined as a traditional European medicine. It's a traditional medicine system that originates from Europe. It branches originally from Hippocrates. It just, at the point where biomedicine branches through Enlightenment to a very reductionist, mechanistic approach. Naturopathy stayed a lot more oriented to the complexity and holism. And so there was a branching that happened, and that was actually at that point that we defined naturopathy as beginning, but actually its roots stem back to Hippocrates. So,
who's Hippocrates? He's a Greek?
Greek, yes, the father of medicine.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so the Hippocratic Oath, people often have heard about. He was from ancient Greece. And he described things in terms of humors and those sorts of things. But you look at some of his teachings and his practices about what helps people in their health. Just healthy diet and getting out and having exposure to fresh air and nature was a key part of his therapeutic, armament.
Yeah.
And so I think over time, man has overvalued our ingenuity to the detriment of recognizing what nature already has to offer. And so naturopathy is is in a very unique position because it stems from that connection with that has that shared roots with biomedicine.
Yeah.
So we actually understand biomedicine very, very well for a traditional medicine. But we also really move to have a balanced approach of adopting new science and new information as it comes through, but still practicing it within that philosophical and principles-based framework.
Yeah. You mentioned biomedicine. That's specifically like plant-based medicine as opposed to some of the more synthetic stuff.
No, biomedicine is conventional medicine. It's pharmaceutical medicine. It's the medicine of today.
Right. Okay.
So no, biomedicine is the medicine of today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right. And of course, Hippocrates would have been advised by cultural, health traditions that go back, obviously, that preceded him way back. So he was what, around 3,500 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and if you go back to, say, the Cro-Magnon, I don't know enough about Cro-Magnon society, but they would have had their own, assuming that humans had evolved as modern humans around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, you've got nearly 200,000 years of finding solutions in nature to deal with ailments that the Cro-Magnon would have had available to them. And then, of course, you've got the Ice Age, and then years pass. And then Hippocrates comes along, and of course, they didn't have written language. And that was also something that was unique about the Greek. It was one of the first cultures that actually had written language, and therefore documents that could be left and looked at thousands of years later, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, Chinese medicine or Chinese were documenting around that time as well. So they have a long history as well, but absolutely. That's where the idea of prehistory versus history. History is when things start getting right down. There's also a lot of, in Europe in particular, the Celtic communities, they chose not to document. They relied primarily on oral tradition on purpose, because they felt that there was too much. I think too much is open to misinterpretation. If you wrote it down, someone could pick it up and read it out of context. Whereas if you're teaching people, they get all of the context, and they ensure that whoever they're saying it to gets all that context as well.
Yeah.
So what was happening around that time is you would have the Greeks. The Greeks heavily influenced the Celts as well. And the Celts were obviously very nature-based spiritual practices and culture. So there's a lot of a mix happening in that area. And the original kind of identified forefather of at the point at which naturopathy became clearly its own practice in medicine was a German-based hydrotherapist, Benedict Lust, and but they draw still on a lot of Mother Hildegard von Bingen, who's another German nun from, goodness, I'm trying to remember, is it the 1300s? Might even be earlier than that. And she was a very, very intelligent woman, very spiritual, very intelligent, and she did a lot of work in codifying how we can use the natural world for health and healing as well.
Yeah, actually, say her name again. Hildegard of what?
Hildegard von Bingen, Bingen.
Right. Okay. I'll tell you a funny story. So a friend of mine who I met in Bellingen a couple of years ago told me about this woman who was she's a monk or something?
Oh, a nun. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and who was probably the best example of the intersection between nature, the way that Vita Sapien would describe it, and Christianity. And she shows up in the literature around naturopathy. Okay, and the thing was that I actually forgot her name, and I started searching what the hell's her name, Googling her, trying to find this monk woman, this nun, and I was sending an email to my friend, but he hasn't responded because he's really busy. And I'm like, she's back.
Well, I tell you what, I just bought this special issue in Dijon in France when I was just there, of all dedicated to Hildegard von Bingen. It is written in French, so I'm not really sure if it's much use to you, but if I can get anything useful out of it in my own meager French, I'll let you know.
Yeah, no, I might just look her up on Wikipedia to start, yeah. rather than learning French. Okay, that's really interesting stuff. Let me just have a look at my notes. That's quite fascinating. Is there the way that when I go onto say Google Scholar looking for science papers on spirituality, I often find that a good chunk of them are coming out of medical practice. So would there be a sort of a distinction in the way that naturopaths deal with spirituality versus the more biomedicine traditional approach, or is it sort of grounded in the same space?
I honestly couldn't say in a definitive way, and that's just the researcher in me hedging my bets. But because ultimately there's it's not something that naturopathy has focused on collecting information about when I practice in this regard, because most of what we've been doing historically when we've been undertaking research about our practices has been collecting information about the stuff that medicine are mostly interested in. And there's actually not a lot of focus on that at this point in time.
Okay.
But what I can say is that things like yoga and meditation and some of those mindfulness practices are really important for tools within naturopathic practice.
Yeah.
So I think that there's that broader practice of finding ways for people to center and even if it's not necessarily they're presenting with anxiety, but just even understanding that having people be calm and centered helps their digestion that's kind of that holistic complex thinking that naturopathy does in its part of its way of helping people through healing.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a theory called terror management theory. Do you deal with that?
No, I haven't heard of it.
So it's not about terrorism. It's this idea that as the human species evolved, there would have come a point at which in the evolutionary process where we became conscious of the fact that we would one day die, right? So something that the other animals don't have is that, well, we don't believe that they have a consciousness about the fact that they're going to one day die. Everything's going swimmingly, and the next minute they're dying. It's the first insight they have to it. And terror management theory sort of posits that at that point of developing the awareness of one's mortality would have created a sort of like a paroxysm of terror. It would have created terror, and it would have disturbed the individual. And what they were saying was that the terror management theory holds that this is sort of the origin of religion. And it's this idea that if one has a worldview and they're living in accordance to the worldview, then that makes the concept of dying so much more palatable.
Right.
So, and it's sort of taken to the extreme with the Christians, which says that if you follow the worldview of the Christians, then you go to heaven for eternity, which makes the whole idea of dying actually kind of not such a bad thing after all, right? Yeah. But just coming back to the point you made about this sort of unease that your digestion is going to be, you'll digest your food more proficiently if you are relaxed. Then part of being relaxed is living in accordance with the worldview. Yeah. And I guess really that's part of what I've been trying to do with in Vita, is to try and write a worldview that gives the human race the best chance of surviving the 21st century.
Yes.
So it's got to be a worldview that's grounded in dealing with climate and ecological collapse, which is our life support system.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's great. This is good stuff. How about we stop here, okay, and then maybe come back and have another conversation down the track when we've got some more thinking and ideas and different areas to explore.
Yeah, love it.
Okay, great.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you, Amie. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.